much of the president's trade war has been deemed illegal by lower courts after a challenge brought by a coalition of Democratic U.S. state attorneys general, led by the Attorney General of Oregon, Dan Rayfield, who joins us live right now. Hi, Mr. Rayfield. Pleasure to welcome you to our program. Thank you for making the time.
Absolutely. Thanks for having us.
I wanted to start off just with your reaction now that we're in receipt of a timeline for how soon the Supreme Court will hear arguments in this case, November. Does the expediency with which that's happening surprise you at all, or is that what you hope for?
No, how fast this moves is going to be dependent on the importance of the issue. And you have, arguably one of the president's biggest initiatives that he's trying to implement by abusing an emergency power that's impacting businesses and consumers across the country. It's impacting international relationships. So it's not unusual that the Supreme Court would choose to fast track it. In fact, that is what we had asked them to do in partnership with the federal government. So it's great to hear that news today, and truly looking forward to getting back in the courtroom and arguing this.
In layman's terms, what is the crux of the legal argument you will present to the court against the imposition of these tariffs?
Yeah, and really simply, the founding document in the United States is our Constitution. And the Constitution specifically says that the power to tariff rests with Congress. So that is their power. Congress gave some of that power to the president under really specific laws. The one law that they didn't give the president that power is under his emergency powers. And so President Trump is the first president to ever use this emergency power in an attempt to implement tariffs. And he did it in a way that is contrary and at odds with all of the other statutes and laws that were passed by Congress to do tariffs. So it's pretty simple. It's an abuse of an emergency power in a way that Congress didn't intend. And therefore, all of those actions are unconstitutional. Pretty simple.
If I understand, and simple to you, but maybe not to me, who is the furthest thing from a legal scholar. If I understand the White House's argument to the contrary, is that the president does have the authority to do it without Congress, based on something called the 1977 International Emergency Economic Powers Act. What is your response to that argument?
Exact same thing. No president since the history of the enactment of that law has ever tried to use it for tariffs. In fact, President Trump himself, during his first 4 years, implemented tariffs, but he did it under the right statutes, the statutes that every other president has used to implement tariffs. So it's pretty simple. If it was so good to use it now, why not have used it during his first 4 years? And why hasn't any other president tried to use it? And why has Congress filed briefs in the court saying, hey, we didn't grant you this power? Additionally, you have judges at multiple levels of our courts disagreeing with the president. And you have judges that were, one of them that was even appointed by the president, and a couple of others that were appointed by Republicans. So you have this diversity of legal scholars, and you have the history of how this law has been used that really kind of show that the president has overstepped his bounds.
How do you think, I guess, or in what way might that inform your view of the way in which the Supreme Court might navigate this? Because I think one of the big differences between Canada and the U.S. and the way our Supreme Courts work is the inherent political nature, to a degree, of the Supreme Court in most recently in the past few years. I think we from the outside would look at this and say, hey, there's a lot of people on that Supreme Court who seem to agree with Donald Trump in instances we wouldn't have thought the Supreme Court would previously, but in some instances they haven't. And you point out some Trump-appointed judges who have, sided with you on this case. How do you anticipate that plays out?
Yeah, and it's one of those interesting situations where I think politicians want to politicize our judicial system, and they want to politicize it when they don't get a ruling they like, and they want to politicize it when they get a ruling they do like. And I think it is foundational upon all of us here in the United States to really adhere to the independence of a judiciary. It's a hallmark of any democracy. And there have been rulings that have come out of the United States Supreme Court that the president hasn't liked. Now, frankly, there's been rulings that have come out that I didn't like either. But what I do believe is that these 9 independent judges are going to take a look at this case, and they're going to see the exact same facts that all of the other justices have seen in this situation, and they're pretty compelling. And ultimately, the argument will be, hey, no president has ever used this power, and this president is abusing an emergency power that Congress never intended. And that is something that is foundational for us as Americans. In this world where what we write in our laws, it doesn't matter who you are, you have to follow those laws. And so the hope is when these justices look at that, they will see what all the other justices have seen.
So this case applies to those so-called reciprocal tariffs and the ones that we have labeled here, to do with the accusations around fentanyl at the border. They don't apply to some of the more punishing sectoral tariffs that have been levied against Canadian exports going into the United States. Do you think that what happens in this case could have any impact on those other tariffs and any potential legal challenges to them moving forward?
Absolutely. And the way to think about that is these are tariffs that are being implemented under this emergency power. So if the court rules that the emergency power doesn't grant the authority for the president to implement any tariffs, that will have a ripple impact upon any tariff that the president has issued under this emergency statute. Now, there's different ways that the Supreme Court could rule that might validate, or not validate, but leave in place some of the tariffs implemented under this statute. And you may have different arguments about whether the tariffs actually deal with the problem itself or whether the problem itself is an extraordinary problem under the statute. So there will be some factual determinations that might need to be engaged in depending on how the Supreme Court rules. The way the lower court ruled, it definitely would have an impact on all of the existing tariffs that have been implemented so far. But remains to be seen, obviously, depending on what the Supreme Court says.
Okay, well, Canadians will be watching as close as ever. Mr. Rayfield, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.